I had been the vice president of engineering at Cascade Technologies for 6 years when the company's new chief executive officer, Brandon Garrett, decided that the quarterly all-hands town hall would be the perfect venue to publicly blame me for a product launch failure that had been caused entirely by decisions he had personally overruled me on 3 months earlier. Cascade was a B2B SaaS company specializing in workflow automation for enterprise clients, headquartered in Denver with about 800 employees and annual recurring revenue approaching $190 million, and I had built the engineering organization from 37 people to 214, shipped 11 major product releases, and maintained a customer satisfaction score that consistently ranked in the top quartile of our industry. The product in question was called OptiFlow 3, a complete platform rewrite that promised customers enhanced performance, better analytics, and seamless integration with third-party tools, and it had been the centerpiece of our sales narrative for the better part of a year. The launch had indeed been troubled, slow adoption, customer complaints about missing features, a critical performance bug that had caused downtime for 3 major accounts during the first week, but the root cause was not engineering execution. It was a series of strategic decisions Brandon had made over my explicit written objections, decisions driven by his determination to meet a board-imposed deadline that had never been technically achievable and that I had warned him, in detailed memos with supporting data, would result in exactly the kind of launch we ended up delivering. Brandon had joined Cascade 8 months earlier, brought in by the board to accelerate growth and prepare the company for a potential acquisition or IPO within 18 months. He came from a larger competitor where he had held the president title, and his reputation was built on aggressive go-to-market strategies, bold revenue commitments, and a management style that prioritized speed and confidence over deliberation and technical nuance. In his first month, he reorganized the executive team to centralize decision-making under his direct control, moved the weekly product review meeting to a format where he made final calls on priorities and timelines, and introduced a new planning cadence that compressed our traditional 4-month release cycles into 8-week sprints. When I raised concerns that shorter cycles would reduce our ability to properly test complex integrations, and that we were already carrying technical debt from previous accelerated releases, he told me that the market rewarded momentum and that engineering teams at high-performing companies learned to operate with urgency. He said this in front of the product and sales leadership, with a tone that implied my concerns were symptoms of risk aversion rather than legitimate technical judgment, and I understood immediately that challenging him further in public forums would be career-limiting. The OptiFlow 3 timeline was set by Brandon in a board meeting where he committed to a launch date in late September, tied to a major industry conference where Cascade would be announcing the product to drive lead generation and demonstrate technological leadership. That date gave engineering 4 months to complete a platform rewrite that my team had estimated would take at least 7 months if we wanted to maintain feature parity with the existing product, address the technical debt we had accumulated, and conduct adequate testing with beta customers before general release. I sent Brandon a detailed project plan showing the critical path, the dependencies, the resource constraints, and the risk analysis, and I proposed either descoping the initial release to focus on core functionality and launching additional features in phased updates, or pushing the launch date to January to allow proper execution. His response was brief. The board had endorsed the September date, our competitors were moving fast, and I needed to find a way to make it work. When I asked whether we could at least schedule a technical review with the board to walk them through the trade-offs, he said the board did not need to be involved in execution details and that my job was to lead engineering, not to question strategic timelines he had already committed to. Over the next 3 months, my team worked with the kind of relentless intensity that extracts short-term output at the cost of long-term sustainability. We cut features, deferred non-critical bugs, reduced the beta testing period from 8 weeks to 3, and focused all resources on getting the platform functional enough to demo well and handle the initial launch load. I documented every compromise in weekly status updates to Brandon, flagging the specific risks, incomplete integration testing with the third-party tools that were central to the product's value proposition, known performance issues under high concurrency that we had not had time to resolve, and gaps in the admin interface that would make it difficult for customers to configure the product without hands-on support from our solutions engineering team. Brandon acknowledged these updates with brief replies that essentially said to keep moving and that we would address issues post-launch through rapid iteration. I kept copies of everything. The launch happened on schedule in late September at the industry conference, and for the first 72 hours it looked like we had pulled it off. The keynote demo went smoothly, the press coverage was positive, and the sales team reported strong interest from prospects who attended the sessions. Then the early adopter customers who had been waiting for 3 began migrating their production workflows from the legacy platform, and the cracks became fractures. The performance issues we had flagged manifested as slowdowns and timeouts during peak usage hours, particularly for customers with complex automation workflows that involved multiple integrations. The third-party integrations that had worked in our limited beta testing started failing in edge cases we had not anticipated, causing data sync errors and workflow interruptions. And the incomplete admin interface meant that customers attempting to configure advanced features were getting stuck and flooding our support channels with tickets that required engineering escalations because the product simply did not have the necessary controls built yet. 3 of our largest customers, all of whom had been using Cascade for years and had migrated to 3 based on our assurances that it was ready, experienced significant disruptions during business-critical operations, and their executive sponsors sent formal complaints to Brandon with escalation warnings that if the issues were not resolved immediately, they would evaluate alternative platforms. Brandon's initial response was to hold daily war room meetings where he demanded updates on fixes, pushed the engineering team to work longer hours, and publicly expressed frustration that issues he described as basic quality problems had made it into production. I participated in these meetings and provided detailed explanations of what was being worked on, what the root causes were, and what the realistic timelines for resolution were. But I also noticed that Brandon was reframing the narrative in a way that positioned the launch problems as execution failures by engineering rather than consequences of the compressed timeline and descope testing that he had insisted on. In a meeting with the customer success team, he referred to the launch as disappointing and said that engineering had overpromised and underdelivered, which was factually backwards. Engineering had underpromised and delivered exactly what we said we could deliver under the constraints he had imposed, but he had made promises to customers and the board based on the product he wanted rather than the product we had told him was achievable. When the customer success VP relayed this characterization back to me, I realized that Brandon was preparing to make me the public scapegoat for the launch problems, and that I needed to be prepared to defend not just my team's work but the factual record of what had actually happened. The quarterly all-hands town hall was scheduled for mid-October in the main cafeteria, a standing room gathering of the entire company where executives presented financial results, strategic updates, and took questions from employees. These meetings were typically collegial, carefully scripted, and designed to build morale and alignment, and while tough questions sometimes came up, they were usually handled with corporate platitudes and reassurances. Brandon opened the town hall with a presentation on revenue growth, customer acquisition, and the successful conference launch, emphasizing the market momentum Cascade was building and the importance of execution discipline as we entered the next phase of growth. Then he transitioned to a slide titled Lessons from OptiFlow 3, and his tone shifted. He said that while the product had generated strong market interest, the launch had been marred by quality issues that had damaged customer trust and required significant unplanned engineering resources to remediate, and that this outcome represented a failure of execution that the leadership team needed to own and learn from. Then he did something I had not anticipated. He put up a slide showing a timeline of the OptiFlow 3 project with my name as the engineering lead, highlighted the September launch date, and listed the customer complaints and performance issues as bullet points under a heading that read Delivered Vs. Committed. He said that engineering had committed to a ready-for-production release and had not delivered on that commitment, and that as the VP of engineering I bore responsibility for ensuring that quality standards were met before launches. He then opened the floor for questions. The room was silent. 800 people, most of whom reported up through my organization or worked closely with engineering, were watching me sit at the executive table while the CEO publicly held me accountable for a failure that anyone who had been paying attention knew was the result of his own timeline decisions. I could feel the weight of their attention, the discomfort, the second-hand humiliation. One of the product managers raised a hand and asked, carefully, whether the launch timeline had been influenced by external factors like the conference date or board expectations. Brandon answered smoothly that while the date had been ambitious, it was the kind of stretch goal that high-performing organizations commit to, and that engineering leadership had agreed to the timeline and should have escalated earlier if they believed it was unachievable. That was a lie. I had escalated, I had sent him memos, I had proposed alternatives, and I had documentation of all of it. But in this moment, in front of the entire company, with Brandon controlling the presentation and the microphone, I understood that defending myself verbally would look defensive and would not change the narrative he was constructing. So I did not speak. I made a decision. I pulled out my phone under the table and opened my email archive. I had a folder labeled OptiFlow 3 Project Decisions that contained every memo, risk assessment, and status update I had sent Brandon over the past 4 months. I also had the original project plan showing the 7-month timeline, the meeting notes from the board session where Brandon had committed to September without consulting engineering, and the final risk summary I had sent him 1 week before launch explicitly detailing the known issues we were shipping with and the mitigation strategies. I forwarded the entire folder to myself at my personal email address. Then I did something that felt simultaneously reckless and necessary. I stood up from the executive table, walked to the laptop controlling the projector, and asked Brandon if I could respond to his presentation with some additional context. He looked surprised but nodded, likely assuming I was going to apologize or commit to improvements. I opened my laptop connected to the projector and closed his slide deck. Then I opened the first document in my folder. The screen behind me now showed an email I had sent to Brandon on May 18, 4 months before the launch. The subject line was OptiFlow 3 Timeline Assessment and Risk Mitigation Recommendations. I did not narrate, I let the room read. The email opened with a clear statement. Based on current scope, resource availability, and the technical complexity of the platform rewrite, engineering estimated that a production-ready launch would require 7 months from kickoff, placing the realistic launch date in late December or early January. I had outlined the critical path, the testing requirements, the integration dependencies, and the specific risks of compressing the timeline. I had proposed 2 alternatives: descope the initial release to core functionality and ship additional features in Q1, or extend the timeline to January and deliver the full scope with adequate testing. The email concluded with a recommendation that we schedule a technical review with the board to ensure they understood the trade-offs before finalizing the launch commitment. At the bottom of the email was Brandon's reply, timestamped 3 hours later. Board has endorsed September launch tied to conference. We need to deliver. Find a way to make it work. This was a status update from late July, 8 weeks before launch, where I had flagged that the integration testing timeline had been cut from 8 weeks to 3 due to resource constraints, and that this reduction significantly increased the risk of production issues with third-party tools. I had listed the specific integrations that were most concerning and had recommended either delaying the launch by 4 weeks to complete proper testing or shipping with a limited integration set, and adding the others in a follow-up release. Brandon's response, again visible at the bottom: cannot delay, sales has committed the date to customers, ship with known risks and plan rapid fixes post-launch. I advanced again. This was the final risk summary I had sent 1 week before launch, a detailed breakdown of the known performance issues, the incomplete admin features, and the integration gaps, with explicit language stating that launching in this state would likely result in customer complaints and escalations, but that engineering had exhausted all options to mitigate within the timeline constraints Brandon had set. His response noted, proceed with launch. But the documents were already on the screen, the emails already read by 800 people who now understood that the failure he had attributed to engineering execution was in fact the predictable outcome of decisions he had made over explicit technical warnings. I did not give him time to respond. I said, speaking to the room rather than to him, that I wanted to be clear about what had happened with OptiFlow 3. Engineering had delivered exactly what we said we could deliver under the timeline and resource constraints that had been imposed. We had raised concerns, proposed alternatives, and documented risks at every stage. The product issues customers experienced were not the result of engineering incompetence or lack of execution discipline. They were the result of strategic decisions to prioritize a conference launch date over technical readiness, decisions that were made by executive leadership despite technical guidance to the contrary. I said that I took full responsibility for the work my team did, and I was proud of the extraordinary effort they had put in to deliver a functional product under impossible conditions. But I would not accept responsibility for the predictable consequences of decisions I had explicitly recommended against and documented in writing. Then I sat down. The silence in the room was different now. It was not the uncomfortable silence of witnessing someone being blamed. It was the stunned silence of watching a corporate narrative collapse in real time. Brandon stood at the front, visibly struggling to regain control, and attempted to reframe what had just happened. He said something about how healthy organizations have robust debates about timelines and priorities, and that the documents I had shown reflected normal project management discussions, and that ultimately the responsibility for launch outcomes rested with the executive team collectively. But his voice lacked the confidence it had carried 10 minutes earlier, and several people in the room were now looking at their phones, likely pulling up their own copies of emails and Slack threads that corroborated the timeline I had just presented. The town hall ended shortly after with no further questions, and people dispersed quickly, the air thick with unspoken tension. Within an hour, I received a calendar invite from the general counsel and the head of HR for a meeting the following morning. I knew what that meant. Publicly contradicting the CEO, even with documented evidence, was not something companies tolerated easily, especially not from executives who were supposed to maintain a united front. I spent the evening preparing for the possibility that I would be asked to resign, and I reviewed my employment contract, my stock option vesting schedule, and the non-disparagement and separation terms. I also reached out to my lawyer not because I intended to sue, but because I wanted counsel on what my rights were if the separation was framed as performance-based or if Brandon attempted to claw back equity. The next morning, I walked into the HR conference room prepared for termination. Instead, I found the general counsel, the head of HR, and two of the independent board directors. The conversation was not what I expected. The general counsel opened by acknowledging that the town hall had been a highly unusual situation, and that the board had been contacted by several employees expressing concern about what they had witnessed. She said the board directors present were there to better understand the facts, and she asked me to walk through the OptiFlow 3 timeline, the decision-making process, and the communications I had shared at the town hall. I did, methodically, without embellishment. I provided context for each memo, explained the technical constraints, and clarified that my objection was not to aggressive timelines in principle, but to launching a product that I knew would create customer problems without adequately communicating those risks to customers or having the resources in place to respond. One of the board directors, a former CTO at a public software company, asked whether Brandon had been aware of the specific technical risks at the time he committed to the September date. I said yes, and that I had documented those risks in writing and proposed alternatives, and that his responses indicated he understood the trade-offs but had decided that meeting the conference date was the higher priority. The director asked whether I had ever been instructed to withhold technical concerns from the board. I paused, then said that I had requested opportunities to present technical context to the board on multiple occasions and had been told by Brandon that execution details were not board-level matters. The meeting lasted 2 hours. At the end, the general counsel thanked me for my candor and said the board would be conducting a review of the OptiFlow 3 project and the decision-making processes around it. She asked whether I would be willing to make my project documentation available to an external party if the board decided to bring in independent counsel or advisors. I said yes. Then she asked whether I intended to continue in my role at Cascade or whether I was planning to resign. I said I had no intention of resigning, that I believed my work spoke for itself, and that I would continue leading the engineering organization as long as I had the board's confidence. She nodded and said she would be in touch. I left the building unsure whether I had just saved my job or ended it. The board review took 3 weeks. During that time, I continued doing my work managing the engineering team, overseeing the remediation of OptiFlow 3 issues, and participating in executive meetings where Brandon and I maintained a cold, professional distance. The company rumor mill was in overdrive, with speculation ranging from my imminent termination to Brandon's potential ouster, and I ignored all of it. The board hired an external consulting firm to review the project documentation, interview key participants, and assess the decision-making process that had led to the launch problems. They interviewed me, Brandon, the product leadership, and several engineers and customer success managers who had been involved in the launch. The consulting firm's report, which I later saw a redacted summary of, concluded that the launch issues were primarily attributable to strategic timeline decisions made by executive leadership without adequate incorporation of technical risk assessments, and that the VP of engineering had consistently escalated concerns and proposed mitigation strategies that were not adopted. The board met in executive session and made 2 decisions. First, they issued a formal communication to the entire company acknowledging that the OptiFlow 3 launch had been challenging, that the board had reviewed the project in detail, and that the issues had resulted from compressed timelines and strategic prioritization rather than engineering execution failures. The communication thanked the engineering team for their extraordinary effort and commitment, and it committed to implementing improved project governance and technical review processes going forward. Second, they informed Brandon that while they appreciated his focus on growth and momentum, his approach to technical decision-making and team communication had created risks that needed to be addressed, and they were placing a senior operating advisor, one of the board directors with deep technical and operational experience, into a temporary role to work alongside him on execution and project governance. It was not a termination, but it was a public check on his authority, and everyone in the company understood what it meant. Brandon resigned 6 months later after the board's operating advisor had effectively been running technical and product decisions, and Brandon had become a figurehead for external communications and fundraising. His departure was announced as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities, and the board named an interim CEO while conducting a search for permanent leadership. I was not a candidate for CEO. I had no interest in the role, and my expertise was engineering rather than general management, but I was asked to stay on as VP of engineering and to take on an expanded role overseeing product and technical operations during the transition. I accepted. The company stabilized, OptiFlow 3 was eventually remediated and became a successful product after an additional 9 months of development, and Cascade ultimately completed a successful acquisition by a larger platform company 18 months later. I left after the acquisition closed not because I was unhappy, but because I had accomplished what I set out to do and was ready for a different challenge. The town hall moment, the 30 seconds when I stood up and put those emails on the screen, became a story that circulated in the industry, usually with dramatic embellishments that were not accurate but captured the emotional truth. A technical leader refusing to be scapegoated for executive failures and using documentation to force accountability. People asked me whether I had planned it, whether I had known I was going to do it before I walked into that meeting. The truth is I had not planned it in the sense of scripting the moment, but I had prepared for it by doing what I always did, documenting my work, raising concerns in writing, creating a factual record of decisions and recommendations. When Brandon chose to publicly blame me for outcomes I had explicitly warned him about, I made a split-second decision to make that record public, not out of revenge, but out of a refusal to let a false narrative define my work and my team's effort. The ending was not cinematic. There was no dramatic firing, no instant vindication. There was a board review, a consulting report, a gradual recognition that the narrative Brandon had constructed was inconsistent with reality, and a slow rebalancing of power and accountability. I was publicly shamed in the town hall. What I showed on the screen did not destroy anyone's career in a single moment, but it ended the false story that my failure had caused the launch problems, and it forced the organization to confront the actual decisions that had led to the outcome we all had to fix. That was enough.